Hello, my name is Angelo Lopez. I'm an editorial cartoonist, and I have the honor today to speak to Byron Bland. Let me give you a little short bio on Byron. Byron is the Associate Director of the Stanford Center on Conflict and Negotiation. He's the Research Associate at the Center of Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's an ordained Presbyterian minister, a former Stanford campus chaplain, and he's an overall nice guy. So welcome, Byron.
Well, thank you, Angela. Let me correct you just slightly. I am retired associate director
Okay.
at the ICM, and I did work at CDDRL as a research, but I am also retired from that as well. So where those things were once true, they're no longer true.
Okay.
But much of the work I did while I was in those capacities. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I know Byron because both of us attend a Sunday morning Presbyterian group, and I really admire Byron's wisdom and insights when he's in the group and stuff. So, and one of the reasons I want to talk to him today is because in November, Byron had a sermon where he talked about his concerns about the polarization in this country right now. And he also talked about the lessons that he learned in peace building and stuff. And if you want to listen to Byron's sermon, you can go to the First Presbyterian Church of Palo Alto's YouTube page. So one of the reasons I was really taken by Byron's sermon is because I'm concerned about polarization too. I'm liberal, but I used to have a lot of conservative friends. And but as the times have gotten more polarized, I lost a lot of those close friendships, and it was a very painful process for me. So I guess to start this conversation, what are your concerns about the polarization in this country right now?
And Angelo, the deep sense of that I get is that we are, let me say first, that we're looking for a way out of polarization through finding agreement. And I think that's not likely. And I think instead what the task is, how do we live with these differences? That's really the peace question about it is how do we live with differences that aren't easily resolved or wished away? I mean, that they persist no matter what we do about them. And the question is, can we live with those differences or not? And I think that part of the polarization that disturbs me is less that there's disagreement. It's how that disagreements becomes polarizing.
Yeah.
And that's really the key. And it seems to me that that's based on two particularly important perceptions. I mean, if you ask yourself the question, what would happen if I'm in a conflict with someone or in some disagreement with one happen? If I ask myself what happens if that person gets what he or she wants, that what they're trying to do comes about, where does that leave me? Yeah. And if my answer to that is bad off, that I'm not, that this is, I can't just, it's not just a minor inconvenience or something that I can tolerate, that it becomes something deeply hurtful and damaging to me, then I think you're in a different situation, and that's what I would call enemy relationships. Yeah. And enemy relationships, oftentimes we think of enemies as just people we have differences with, but I want to use it in a very special sense, that it has to do with the perception that people seek our destruction. And that destruction can be broad. It can be not physical, or it can be psychological, or it can be social, communal, but that those aspects of our lives which are important to me are under attack. Yeah. And that leads to the sense that I have an enemy, someone who is seeking the destruction of important parts of me. And when I'm in that situation, it's hard or impossible to resolve conflict. And quite often, the attempt has been, well, to try to create superordinate goals that the people can, and those come initially from a set of experiments done by the robber cave. It's known as robber eggs, and it was done by uh, Maurice Sheriff, and he's sometimes called Sharif, but he was actually called Sheriff, as I understand it. That he
Oh,
was a sheriff,
oh.
and
But Omar Sharif was popular, so they might be conflating the pronunciation and
yeah,
stuff.
it could be. Well, it could be, but I heard from social psychologists that um, Omar Sharif is famous, but Maurice Sharif is a different
Oh,
person.
okay. Okay.
Uh, and he set up these things called the robber cave experiments, and they took groups of people who didn't know each other and gave them identities, and then created situations in which those identities created vast differences and antagonisms with one another. And there were all kinds of fights and things and identity polarizations that took place. And then they took them on trips where they had to work together in order to get out of the situation or deal with a particular problem. And that those things went away. And
Uh,
it produced the sense that the way to overcome deep conflicts and divisions was to create superordinate goals.
mhm.
When I talk to social psychologists almost across the board, that's what they tell me the solution is.
Uh,
And I think with my friend Lee Ross, who's a pretty renowned social psychologist, we came up with the sense that if you could identify superordinate goals and get people to adhere to them, you wouldn't have a serious conflict to begin with.
uh,
And so yes, that would do it if you could do those. But the problem is that you really can't. And the
mm,
reason you can't is that each side correctly probably perceives that if the other side gains an advantage, it will use that advantage against them.
uh,
And so no matter, I will do without rather than giving them an advantage because they will use that advantage against them. And that creates what I call and have seen a hostile peace, which is that my primary point of engagement in politics is to prevent the other side from getting what it wants.
yeah. Yeah.
Because everything that they achieve is a step toward an outcome I couldn't bear. And I think that's where we pretty much are. Let me throw in one other set of distinctions, which I think are important. And that is the distinction between what I would call mistrust and distrust.
Mhm.
But that a lot of this is based on the sense that it's just mistrust, that we don't know enough about the other side to trust them. And if we knew more about them, we would be able to build trust with them.
Yeah.
And I think that to a degree that that's true and is true about many things. But when you move into the area of distrust, which I think characterizes deep violent divisions within a society, that what it is not a matter of not knowing. They know enough to distrust the other side. What distrust is perception that they intend harm.
Yeah.
That from any encounter with them, harm will come my way.
Mhm.
And so that's a much more difficult thing to overcome than mistrust. If you have
Yeah.
mistrust, you just put them together and get them to talk.
Yeah.
If you overcoming distrust, you've got to create trust that the other person does not and will not intend harm for me and do harm to me. And so I think that's more the kinds of things that worry me in this society than than some of the more what I might call superficial things.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned that in your sermon. You talked about how you know, um, you know, people need to have faith that they can lose
Hmm.
and still be able to live, you know, with the results, even if they lose and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what you're getting at right now, right? And because when I heard that part of the sermon, I thought of the Capitol insurrection, right?
Hmm.
And how when a group of people feel like they can't lose, it's difficult, they do extreme things and stuff.
Yeah.
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, democracy is based on the belief that you can lose an election
Mhm,
or lose whatever a vote in a particular thing, and that you can live with the outcome of that.
mhm,
If you can't, it takes on much more antagonism and deep fear about it. And so a lot of this stuff began and let me just tell a little story. So I met with my friend Lee Ross with a high level Israeli uh, scientist technician, and he was discussing with us and said, tell us how to find our Palestinian Mandela.
mhm.
And I thought that was an interesting challenge. And I thought about it, and there was something and always a bit off about that child, finding my Palestinian Mandela, because it wasn't really that the clerk and the Afrikaners found Mandela. I mean, that Mandela was there all the time. So what does it mean to find your Palestinian Mandela? And I wrestled with that for about 6 months or so. And then finally, it just walking on the beach one day, it dawned on me that Mandela won. that, that he got the things he wanted. He wanted he wanted one person, one vote, and a constitutional process that would leave the ANC essentially in power.
Oh, okay.
And de Klerk in the end gave it to him.
Yeah.
So why? And it was because de Klerk began to see in Mandela a future he didn't think was possible.
Oh,
And so if you ask people in South Africa, what does peace look like in a post-apartheid era, they would all point to Mandela. It looks like Mandela. And
oh,
so Mandela became the person to whom it was safe to lose.
yeah.
That the Afrikaners could lose to Mandela and still have essentially the life they wanted and cherished.
Yeah.
There would be certain things that were gone, and certainly the guarantees of that position over a large Black African workforce. But for the most part, they could be who they were and live and enjoy with one another. Now that gets tested, and it never gets kind of implemented in the full perfection of that vision. But the fact is that finding your Mandela depended upon finding the person to whom you could lose or do things you said you could never do. And
Yeah.
that was the breakthrough between Mandela and de Klerk. And so I said back to you find me the Palestinian to whom you're willing to give concessions that you said were absolutely off the table, and I'll show you your Palestinian Mandela.
Yeah.
And I think that in various ways I saw that played out in Northern Ireland. Davy Irvine was that sort of person. He
Oh,
was a paramilitary member of the Ulster Volunteer Force. He was caught as a bombing. He was a bomber, and he was caught, sent to prison, spent 7 or 8 years in prison, and during that time bloomed into one of the wisest political leaders I know, or have known.
oh,
And it was, and at his funeral he died unfortunately, and of a massive heart attack, actually before he was to visit me at Stanford again in a month.
mhm,
And at his funeral there were people from all over the place, and his brother, who I'm not positive about this, but I believe was a Presbyterian minister, said
oh,
at his funeral that I hear Jerry Adams, who was head of the Sinn Féin and the political wing of the IRA, is here. And I want to let you know, Jerry, you're welcome.
oh,
And it was a mass gathering of people, 900, but I mean, out into the streets of people who saw this person as the person who envisioned peace in a way that they found safe. And
oh,
I think that trying to find those kinds of people in our society is critically important from moving on.
mhm,
So as a Democrat and as a liberal, who is the conservative to whom I think
mhm,
I could lose to on
yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
still feel like that parts of me that are important to me were not under threat and remained intact. And that I think is a major challenge today.
Yeah.
Uh, and what concerns me is that to get in leadership position, in many instances, both on the Republican and Democratic sides, you have to further polarize the
Yeah.
population to secure your base, as opposed to finding ways to bridge the differences between the two parties.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think part of that is in the primaries, whenever, both the Democrats and Republicans, you tend to have to appeal to the base, right?
Mhm.
And then in the general elections, you have to appeal to the broader electorate and stuff. And so during the primaries and stuff, for the Democrats, the more progressive candidate, for the
Right.
Republicans, the more, Trumpist candidate and stuff. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
guess that's been a struggle, I guess.
Well, there are kind of various election reforms like ranked voting and that sort of stuff
Yeah.
um, that that would lessen these things. I don't think that they get at the fundamental dynamic. And I try to analyze that through making a distinction between democracy and politics.
Uh, okay.
And I define them. You'll find that in our conversation, I'm going to be making distinctions all the time because I
Okay.
think they're useful for people to think about where they are and what to do in their situation. And so the distinction between um, I made one earlier on the distinction between mistrust and distrust, because I think that helps us recognize where we are in a conflict and what it is we should do. The distinction between democracy and politics, I think politics is a way of engagement that reconciles differences.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think democracy is a way of electing people to make decisions for ourselves
Yeah.
uh, in our behalf. And so, as many people know, you throw divided societies into a democratic environment, and it polarizes them further.
Yeah.
I mean, they then really do go at each other's throat. And
Yeah.
so, I think the task is how do you get democracy and politics to pull in the same direction,
Uh-huh.
so that by electing people who represent our views and act as decision makers for us, it moves us toward the resolution of conflict, not toward the polarization that stalemates politics.
Yeah.
And I think that there are reforms that can help with that.
Yeah.
Uh, but the fundamental problem is, do you have a vision of a shared future? And what that could take just a minute to talk about that. What we discovered in my work in Northern Ireland, and I should pause here just a minute to say that I worked for several years in the funding for 4 years, but then the relationships carried on even to this day. A project funded by the Hewlett Foundation on what was the relationship of grassroots dialogue to political and social reconciliation.
Mhm.
And we worked with a group called Community Dialogue, which was formed to create conversation across the violent interfaces of Northern Ireland in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. There was going to be a referendum about whether we should endorse or adopt the Good Friday Agreement. We knew that while politicians may come up with an agreement, there weren't the relationships on the ground to sustain that agreement. And so
Yeah.
it was going to take grassroots conversation and dialogue in order to create the kinds of relationships that would allow and support for that agreement to be implemented.
Mhm.
And we discovered in the end something that I would sum up. I mean, it took us years and years beyond the project to put it in this formulation. But it's not that agreements make for peaceful relationships, but peaceful relationships make agreements possible.
Mhm.
And so the challenge for dialogue and for any society is, how do you give shape to the kind of relationships that would allow the parties to reach agreements?
Mhm.
We thought that those relationships took shape around 4 questions, we call them, because one of the kind of innovative things we brought to Northern Ireland was to not give answers to their problems, or to provide them with mechanisms for addressing them, but rather to say, why don't you ask yourself these questions? These questions are important. And so the first and foremost important question was the notion of a shared future. Can you create a shared future with the other side?
Yeah.
And a shared future is important because it's not a vision. We think of it as, pardon my fumbling here, but we think of a vision of a shared future as opposed to a shared vision of the future. So a vision of a shared future is that I hear what the other side wants. I hear about it, them talk about their dreams and goals and aspirations for themselves, their families, their community, their culture. And I say, if that future came about, could I live with it? There's a place for me there. I would find it bearable, even if just minimally bearable. I wouldn't like it. I may work day and night to overturn it or change it, but if it came about, I could live with it.
Mhm.
And and if the other side feels the same way, you now have a domain of possible futures, in which we share that future together. We don't agree, but we share about what that future is tolerable. It's a domain of bearable futures that exist in front of us. A
Mhm.
shared future is about arriving at a shared vision of a future. It's about finding the one we want, that we share the vision of the future we want. Most societies don't do that, and certainly liberal societies are based on the assumption that there isn't a common consensus about what a good life is. So
Mhm.
therefore, you have lots of them, but that they can exist together in debate, in competition, in conversation. I mean, all kinds. But that these kinds of different notions can exist with one another peacefully.
Yeah. Is it,
And
oh, go ahead.
that's the key. That's the key question.
Mhm. So is it like, if you have a, if you're in if you're in a situation where you believe that a shared future is possible, and that, you can have faith that you can lose, where, you're not, you don't feel threatened, right? You have to, it's kind of based on a belief that, if you lose and you don't like you don't like how things are going, you believe in the possibility of reform, that you have a basic belief in the electoral process, so that if you don't like it, you can go about and try to persuade people, try to make the arguments and stuff, and you have a basic belief that you have a chance of possibly winning the next, changing people's minds. And whereas it seems like today there is a lack of trust in the electoral, um, process now. There's a lack of belief in institutions, and part of that lack of faith is what's feeding the polarization. So we no longer feel we have the same faith in the electoral process that we did, maybe 20 years ago and stuff. Maybe that's
Yeah.
feeding that spirit of authoritarianism.
I think one comment, and then I want to go deeper into something I said earlier. I mean, I think that what we tend to judge the faith in the electoral process is, does it give me the answers I want?
Hmm.
And so I have faith in it if it elects the people I want elected, if it enacts the laws I want enacted. Where I think that faith in the system has to be deeper than that.
Yeah.
And so it and I think here the other three questions come to bear on that. The other three questions had to do with trustworthiness.
Hmm.
So how can I trust you
Yeah.
after, in the case of Northern Ireland, 30 years of shooting at me? How can I trust you then to move into a shared future with me? The second one of those is, how can I accept the losses so I can make the concessions that living together imposes on us? Every negotiated settlement is less than what each party wanted,
Hmm.
so it imposes losses on them. And can I accept those losses so I can make the concessions that living together entails? And then the last one, it also poses on me things that I think are unjust. And so, how do I deal with our notions of just entitlement?
Hmm.
In many situations, and in normal community relationships, justice exists as a kind of fairness, and It's a Rawlsian question of where would I be if I didn't know my location in society? What are the principles and policies that I would endorse? I could be at the top of the economic society. I could be at the bottom of the economic society. But if I didn't know where I was, what would I think would be fair?
Mhm.
And then enact those. And I think those largely govern interactions within a working, stable community. Uh, when you come to conflict, notions of justice change dramatically, and they don't have to do with fairness. They have to do with getting that to which I think I'm entitled.
Yeah.
And what stands in the way is the other side. And so it becomes quite different since we don't agree with what each side is entitled to. That's
Mhm.
what the disagreement is largely about. And
Yeah.
if there was kind of some common sense of what justice entailed, then the conflicts wouldn't be as divisive as they are. And so what we think is that it may not be possible to get a full-blown notion of what justice is and implement it. It is possible to identify the most egregious injustices that living together imposes on us. And
Yeah.
how can we work together to overcome them?
Yeah.
And I think those have to, that sense of relation, I mean, we're talking about the kinds of relationships that allow a community to engage in electoral politics
Yeah.
in a functioning way. And I think that the relationships take shape as differing parties engage those questions of what does it mean to be trustworthy? What does it mean to have a shared vision? What does it mean to accept losses for the sake of living together? And what does it mean to how to live with one another, since we think that in living with them imposes injustices upon us? How do we deal with that?
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think these begin to create a framework for assessing the relationships we need to create if we're going to live with our differences.
Yeah. Yeah. When I listen to what you say about trustworthiness, it reminds me of like there's a big difference when I've had conflicts with conservatives who are strangers as opposed to conservatives who are friends and
Mhm,
stuff, you know. Um, with the conservatives who are strangers, they tend to debate a stereotype of what liberals are
mhm,
and stuff, right? Whereas conservatives who are friends, at least in the beginning and stuff, they knew me and stuff. We knew each other that's apart from our political labels and stuff. So it used to be when we would talk politics, we cared enough about the friendship not to go too far and insult each other, right?
mhm.
But that kind of changed because of quite a few of my conservative friends, they moved out of California and they moved to red states, and I think I'm wondering if that be you know what you're that trustworthiness becomes more difficult when you live in a bubble. Like there's the progressive bubble, there's the conservative bubble. When you're in a bubble, it's more difficult to have trustworthiness when you view the other side as a stereotype, and you don't really know a conservative or you really don't know a progressive. I'm wondering if that's part of the issue with trustworthiness is the difficulty, at least in America. I'm not sure how, I'm guessing it's probably the same in Northern Ireland, is when you live in a sort of bubble and stuff and you don't really know people personally, you're more likely to see the stereotype of that person and not the person.
I think that um I mean I've lost friends over this divide as
Mhm.
well. And it is a painful um process. Um to have those deep friendships that you thought could endure anything uh, fall apart.
Yeah.
And but part of it, I think, relates to. Um, I mean, there are a lot of things to say about that, and I'm trying to figure out which is the best one to kind of approach it. The um, we tend to think that we see the world as it really is, and we
Mhm.
call that naive realism. And it's a tautology, because if we didn't see the world the way we thought it was, we change the way we see the world to correspond to the way that it really is. about it. And so we think that when we encounter people we don't know, we just think they're idiots. I mean, and so it's really just they don't know enough. Let me tell them the right answer, and then they will. And if they don't, then I just know they're idiots. And it depends on what the division is. With friends, it's much more personal.
Yeah.
I mean, and it more quickly comes to distrust than mistrust. I mean, I know enough about them. I know who they are about that. And if they are persisting in their things, then it is because they intend harm.
Mhm.
And that's difficult to deal with. So that when you look at friends, close friends that you have broken up with, it has to do with, in many instances, to the sense of they're causing me pain. They're causing me
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, um, they're devaluing me.
Yeah.
And
I,
so I think that those are more difficult. There are a lot of underlying dynamics going on there, but the basic thing is that they've broken a sense of trust.
yeah. That's
And
why when you said about trust and stuff, that sort of clicked in my mind, my own personal experience and stuff is because, you know, you don't have to trust a stranger, but you built up a level of trust with a friend that I think part of the pain is that the trust was broken and stuff.
yeah,
I kept thinking like, I thought I knew you, you know, and I thought we had this in common and stuff. What happened? Why are you seeing me different
yeah,
and stuff?
yeah.
And I think part of that, you know, I think, conflicts with friends and stuff. It's that trust that hurts, that the loss of trust that hurts.
Yeah. The sermon that you heard and I preached was based on because of the first part of an essay that I wrote on what I thought was initially I cast it as a coming civil war, and I later cast it as the notion of the Troubles, which is what people called their violent period in Northern Ireland, that it was troubling, that
Mhm.
it was menacing, and it
Yeah.
was everywhere, but it didn't take the form of what people thought of as civil war.
Okay.
Although it was perfectly possible to correctly call that a civil war, it took the sense and so how I began to frame it within the notion of a sense of threat and foreboding that I call the Troubles, and episodic but regular acts of violence occurring, which
Yeah.
deepen the polarization and distrust. And the things we've talked about so far were geared toward uh, um, trying to prevent that outcome. Uh, as after that sermon, I subsequently thought that there were two other problems. One was how do we walk things back, and
Yeah.
another one was how do we create normal politics. And I've spoken some about the difference between democracy and politics that led into the exploration of what constitutes normal politics, where our electoral processes and our political engagements pull in the same direction.
Yeah.
Walking things back is more difficult than people think. It's not just a matter of stopping the rhetoric or stopping the things, because every time we've made a charge or we've created those divisions, we've created not mistrust but distrust, that they intend harm to us. And if you look at the political rhetoric on the far right or the far left, it is very clearly saying that the other side over there intends harm for us,
Yeah.
and we've got to stop. And
Mhm.
it's much more difficult to walk that back and you can't just do it by quitting.
Yeah.
You really have to overcome what's the sense of distrust, what's the sense of harm that people are intending for me. And where I think that one of I mean, that's characteristic of a situation in which we don't know what a shared future would look like.
Oh, okay.
And so it becomes, my friend Lee and I, when we would work in Israel, Palestine, or the Northern Ireland, or any other place we said the key to this is creating a vision of a shared future. In the last 10 years here, we've come face to face with the notion, well, I don't quite know what a shared future looks like in this country.
Yeah.
And so what do I do if I don't know what constitutes a shared future?
Yeah.
And so we began by saying that while we had said that it was a shared future that drove our other three questions of trustworthiness, loss acceptance, and just entitlements, that in this case we didn't know what that shared future was, and so could we use the other three questions to begin to formulate what were the characteristics of a shared future that we could use to try to envision what that might look like. And we came up with three. One was encouraging respect.
Mhm.
One was promoting dignity,
Mhm.
and one was safeguarding livelihoods.
Yeah.
And I think if the difference between dignity and respect is dignity is how I think about myself, respect is what I think about others.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we thought that if you began to explore those questions or those themes in our common light of what do we do to encourage respect?
Yeah.
What do we do to foster dignity? What do we do to safeguard livelihoods? How can we do that together? Then it would at least begin to identify the pieces of a shared future that we might put together.
Um, some of our viewers may not know of your experience in peace building. So could you, I know that you've done work in peace building for Northern Ireland and between the Israelis and Palestinians. Could you tell me a little bit about that? And, how did you get interested in that?
Oh, Angelo, I grew up in the heart of the civil rights movement. It was in the Deep South,
Yeah.
uh, and rather than seeing it on the news, I saw it around me,
Mhm.
and so it deeply changed my life, and it, I mean, more so than you can imagine, and so that was the kind of background and culture I brought to college life when I became aware of the Vietnam War
Mhm.
and needed to figure out what was my reaction to that. As many folks, I joined ROTC. I mean, my father, who was a World War II veteran, said you're going to have to go to the Army, and it's better to go as an officer than an enlisted man. So join ROTC, and I did. I signed up,
Yeah.
and then realized that it was so easy to necessarily get out of it. I was commissioned, and then as a lieutenant, and then given a leave of absence to go to seminary when I went with the expectation that when I graduated, and if I was called up, I would come and serve as a chaplain in the military. And I spent much of my seminary education wrestling with that question.
Mhm.
The questions of war and peace, of social justice, of how best to pursue those things, what were the kinds of skills you needed to pursue them, what was my place in that mix of things. And when I graduated, and although I never received the notice to report for active duty, I was recontacted. And at that point, I applied for a conscientious objection discharge, uh, based not on that I didn't think the Army deserved ministers, but I thought they shouldn't be in the chain of command. And so that was not going to happen. And so I was granted a conscientious objection discharge. One of the questions that they based that category, it's a selection, it's a discharge collection. If you're in the Army, you do, and most of the people think of it as a selective service classification, like 1A or something else. You get a CO classification. But one of the questions you had to address was, how is this evidence in your life? And I thought that was a serious question. I mean, I wanted to do this with some sense of integrity and not
Mhm.
just convenience. And so I began to try to think about how was I going to have that evident in my life and have it for the rest of my ministerial career?
Mhm.
And so when I came to Stanford, there were some things that I wanted to do, one of which was to reinstitute a peace studies course.
Yeah.
And I got together. Oh, there had been one, and it had dissolved and fallen apart. And I was trying to recreate one,
Mhm.
and and to do it on a little bit firmer academic basis. And so I began to organize and bring to convene a group of faculty who had similar concerns about teaching peace studies, and organized a course which I taught for 25 years.
Mhm.
And so it was in part of that kind of engagement that I went to the Center for International Security and Arms Control,
Mhm.
where I worked in the ethics division and it was largely based on deterrence, nuclear deterrence. And as the Cold War fell apart, there was a rise in internal or domestic conflicts or regional conflicts.
Mhm.
And I drifted toward analysis of that. I met through through the director, David Holloway, a friend of his, Brian Lennon, and hosted them over here. And Brian was a Jesuit priest, and we began to talk. And so I became more deeply involved in how I and he might work together to create kind of the conversations and engagements that would deal with that conflict. And it was out of that the idea of he created community dialogue from
Mhm.
those kinds of conversations. And I moved to be the associate director of the Stanford Center on what was then conflict and negotiation, and became the Stanford Center on international conflict and negotiation.
Yeah.
Uh, and um, and I began that involvement with Brian around that project. And so I became deeply involved in that. At some point, I wrote a paper about creating a political language for peace, and also wrote up a report about getting beyond cheap talk was the title of it, but it was a report of the concepts that I learned. And I didn't want to illustrate or those conflicts by saying this is you. So I illustrated them from another conflict that I knew, which was Israel Palestine. And
Yeah.
Israelis and Palestinians got a hold of the question and thought it was really about them, and so they asked me to become involved there. Um, and I have to tell them I had never been there before, but I was looking forward to going.
Uh,
Part of that arose from the late 80s, when if you had asked people, particularly as the rise of internal and identity-based conflicts were on the rise, what were the most intractable conflicts in the world? They would have named three:
mhm.
uh, Northern Ireland, South Africa, and Israel Palestine. And so I began to look at those to see what happened. I mean, we were in many ways we were in the midst of the move to the post-apartheid and Mandela, in which my I've not ever been to South Africa, but my study of those began to highlight and suggest that there were similar things between these two conflicts, and
Mhm.
that some of the things what were the dynamics that produced movement in South Africa, and could those dynamics produce a movement in Northern Ireland first, and then later, uh, did they also correspond to what could be done in Israel Palestine?
Yeah.
And so that's how that's my journey toward this place.
Oh, okay. Okay. Was it gratifying to, like, be able
Oh
to
yeah.
see what theories work and what don't? You can actually do that work on the ground, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, the SEICN was a very small but very prestigious group of faculty. I
Mhm.
mean, there were uh, in that initial group that I went to, there were two Nobel laureates. One would get his Nobel laureate more recently, and there
Okay.
was a third who had deceased but would have gotten the Nobel laureate had he been alive. But his partner in research received it, and their collaboration was noted in his. So we tend to count them as three Nobel laureates.
Oh,
The other people were not Nobel laureates, but they were highly recognized nationally and internationally. Lightly as a social psychologist. And so
Uh,
this was a very prestigious group. And what I tried to do was not compete with them on the level of research or theory, but instead to look at what was the relationship of theory and practice.
uh,
And much of the work that we did was based on a kind of collaboration between the two that tried to embrace that the questions of if researchers knew everything that practitioners knew, what would they think was interesting?
uh, okay.
And if practitioners knew everything that researchers knew, what would they think was most important and interesting? And so we began that kind of exchange. It's always gratifying
No,
and enhancing to engage in people who are struggling with real deep issues.
yeah.
And so, sure, I found it gratifying.
Okay.
People ask me, how could you do this? And it's so frustrating. And I had the opposite experience, and I thought it was energizing. And
Uh,
I mean, it uh, was at times frustrating, but that it was always about something that I felt made me a better human being.
oh, okay. Hey, thank you. Thank you. You know, I'm curious. You talked previously about finding another Mandela, somebody who you can learn to lose and have faith that that Mandela would you'd be safe, right? I'm curious. A couple of years ago, I learned about the Reverend Will D. Campbell.
Uh-huh.
He's a white Southern Baptist minister, and
Yeah.
during the 1950s and 1960s this white Southern Baptist minister both participated in the Black Civil Rights Movement, but he also reached out to poor Southern white communities.
Mhm.
And so he tried to act as a bridge builder between both communities. Um, I don't know if he's exactly the same analogy as what you're saying about Mandela, but would you kind of consider him sort of a role model for bridge building?
Oh,
And
sure.
if you and what other Christians would you think of as sort of bridge builders that we can learn lessons from in today's polarized age?
Well, first, let me say, I mean, Will Campbell, for those of you who want to, he wrote a magnificent book called Brother to a Dragonfly, which was about both his work and his relationship with his addicted brother,
Hmm.
which I think is quite moving. Um, and along with the Highlanders and Institute, which was the place where many of the civil rights movement were trained.
Hmm.
Uh, I, I I have high respect for those folks, and I identify with kind of a tradition of Southern radicals that
Hmm.
oppose the segregation and racism of the South. There is a tendency to see. I mean, even when I first came here, the fact that I talked with a Southern accent was a mark against me.
Hmm.
And but there was a whole tradition there that I identify with that is stronger than most posts think.
Hmm.
And and as well as, I mean, it's not only Southern radicals. I mean, there were many um, moral and dedicated people who wrestled with segregation and tried to respond to it
Yeah,
creatively. I mean, the those kinds of structures don't go away because you wake up one day and say, "Well, I understand this. And now I see this is a racist society. It should change."
yeah.
Uh, that doesn't happen that way. And
Hmm.
so I found great inspiration from those who wrestled with and struggled and suffered under those conditions.
Yeah,
Um, I don't find the South is the only place where racism occurs,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that it is prevalent in many ways in the societies that out here in California or other places. It just takes a different form,
Hmm.
and usually somewhat a covert form. I mean, I've oftentimes been in church situations where people talk about when they met, they became aware of or met people who were of a different race. Uh,
Hmm.
and I'm just astounded. I mean, 50% of from every moment of the day that I was there, 50% of the population and you follow where I grew up, was Black.
Yeah.
And so this idea of, I remember when I met my first Black, how can that be?
Yeah.
Is, but so, you know, King got a lot from Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a theologian,
Yeah.
and I did too. My mentor in seminary was a guy named John Fry, who worked with the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago,
Hmm.
and I learned a great deal from him. Uh, there are Floyd Tompkins, whom I think you've met, who's a close friend of mine.
Oh,
I'm older than he is, but he has mentored me in many pastoral situations, and his insight is incredibly valuable to me. And there's a very close friendship.
oh.
Uh,
Did I meet him, I guess, or was he in the?
well, he's been at early church. I don't know if you were there that day that he was, but
Oh, okay. Yeah, it would have been nice to have met him, but
yeah,
I don't know.
he actually, I met him at Stanford when I was a campus minister, and he was on the university staff as associate dean of religious life.
Mhm.
And he subsequently moved on, went to Georgia, came back. He worked as vice president of the seminary that I went to before it closed,
Mhm.
and um, he now has, as a part-time, my old job at Stanford.
Yeah.
Uh, and so we see each other and talk to each other regularly,
Yeah.
and still engage in common projects together.
Um, I'm curious, in terms of bridge building and stuff, I always think that for Will D. Campbell, part of the reason he was able to, you were saying how trust is important. It seemed like Will D. Campbell took the time to build up trust in both the Black and the white communities in the South and stuff. And for these other people you mentioned, was there also that same sense of trust that they built up to be as and how do you build that? Is it just you just have to do it, the hard work of doing it, day after day, is it just time that builds up if you show you care and stuff, and if you just show up, that's the impression I get from reading about Will D. Campbell. He just showed up and he showed that he cared, you know.
I think that's right. I think it's showing up, but I also think it's an openness to learning.
Hmm.
That when you show up, you don't show up with "I got the answer."
Yeah.
You show up with "I need to learn. I need
Okay.
I need." I mean, one of we I recently had a gathering a couple years ago of people that I went to school with, and we
Hmm.
were asked and both of us, all of us, are now in our 70s, and and we asked what were we planning to do with the rest of our lives, since the end of that life is foreseeable,
Yeah.
and we where you don't know when it will be. I know that it could be any day, and that's not the same sense as when I was 40.
No.
That could be any day when you're 42, but it's less likely. This is more realistic, you know,
Uh-huh.
that my day, the sense that to some extent my days are numbered, even though I don't know the number.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I wanted to was to remain curious.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a process of showing up, of investing in
Mhm.
those relationships,
Yeah.
um, of being a willingness to learn about it, to be taught by
Uh-huh.
others, uh, and um, and not selling them out when it becomes easy to do.
Yeah. 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 I'm
I mean,
curious.
let me say a little bit about that, because I
Oh,
think that what those of us who tend to be from majority or dominant culture groups in society tend to think of that as showing up and protesting
mhm.
every time you can, and intervening. But I don't. I think it's the long-term struggle to rectify those injustices, and that's different from disrupting things.
Yeah.
I think we've had a discussion, as you well know, of whether the mission of our church should be promoting or disrupting injustice or rectifying injustice.
Yeah.
And I think that the long-term task is to rectify injustice, which is really hard and difficult to do.
Hmm.
Disrupting is performative in many instances, and it just remains confused and disrupted at the end.
Yeah.
But altering and changing the kinds of relationships that exist in our society is very it's difficult,
Yeah.
and it takes a great deal of thought and reflection and commitment to do that. I despair sometimes when I hear people talk and they think that the solution is obvious.
Yeah.
Uh, and so the question is, why don't you just have the will to get there?
Yeah.
And I think that it's much more deeply intractable
Yeah.
or entrenched, may be a better word,
Yeah.
than we oftentimes realize, and that struggling to make incremental progress along that is probably the best thing, because I don't think we have the magic bullet that transforms it overnight. Although when change comes, it can be massive, and it can be rapid.
Yeah.
But it's always been preceded by long, gradual struggle. And
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. You know, um, part of the, I think, you know, going past polarization, at least in my eyes, is reaching out to Trump voters, reaching out to Trump supporters and stuff. But, I don't know if you see this as a dilemma, but for me, I have always wondered, I want to reach out to Trump supporters, but I don't want to throw under the bus the minorities that are threatened by Trumpism and stuff. And I think about the African American situation after the Civil War and stuff. During Reconstruction, um, the African American community gained a lot of citizenship rights. But after the Reconstruction ended and the South began passing Jim Crow laws, the African American community lost a lot of their rights, right? But I also realized that a lot of Trump voters come from these blue collar communities in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt. And from what I've read, a lot of those communities have been hard hit by the opioid crisis. A lot of the jobs that used to provide these communities with a stable middle class living got outsourced. There's been a huge rise in suicides among older white males in those communities. So I do think that the Trump supporters in those communities have some legitimate grievances. But I'm wondering, how do we, you may not have an answer, but one of the things I'm always wondering is, how do we walk the tightrope where we reach out to these kind of white blue collar communities while at the same time speaking out against racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, anti-Asian hate, that seems to be emanating from the populist right that's in a lot of these communities.
Angela, that's a difficult question, and I would start to answer it from the thing I mentioned earlier about encouraging respect.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, it's distinguished from dignity, in that dignity is how I think about myself. Respect is about how I think about others. And so you have to ask the question, how do I find something to respect
Yeah.
in the others? And I think it begins with, I can't respect all of their actions. I can't even respect all of their opinions, but I can respect their lived experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that much of the polarization has been politicians have capitalized on the sense that they don't respect us. They don't value our lived experiences. And I, for the most part, find that true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of the reason that many Trump people feel looked down upon is that the left has looked down upon them.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
it's not a mystery.
Yeah.
And and so I think that has to be reversed. There are people whom it I can't I you know I just they're beyond the pale and I can't do anything about it. That's fine. I don't mind trying to vote them down about
Yeah.
this stuff. But there are many more people I have the sense that when push comes to shove, they're more humane and caring than we sometimes give them credit.
Yeah.
And that many of their views are cast in that ways because we don't take seriously their lived experience.
Yeah.
I think it's a mirror image of the reverse too, I mean, but I think there's probably the you never change anyone by first making them feel stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that the left has decided that it can change the right, hard right,
Yeah.
by making them feel stupid.
Hmm.
And I think that that's just a waste. Then just it'd be better if you didn't engage in anything
Hmm.
than to do that. I think it was Michael. I'm not sure, but it was someone who said that you may not remember what someone says, but you will remember how they made you feel.
Yeah.
And what I try to do is when I encounter someone is to make them feel that I engage them
Yeah.
even if I disagreed with them. I mean, there are many things. I mean, I for one read conservative commentators, uh, and I think one of I mean, there are a couple of them that I read. I don't agree with their opinions, but I take seriously their analysis
Hmm.
of the situation. David French is one.
Yeah.
Who recently
I
joined
like
the
him.
New York
Yeah.
Times stance. Russ Dowdeth, I also read because he was one who he presents an important perspective, and I
Yeah.
need to value and respect that perspective, even if I don't value the conclusions he draws from that perspective.
Yeah.
David Brooks at one point was one, although David Brooks is now saying things that I agree with much more
Yeah.
uh, than he used to.
Yeah.
But when he falls into his conservative framework, I tend to. I mean, his analysis is in many ways influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr,
Yeah.
who influenced King and many other people, and was a great influence on me.
Yeah.
And,
I've
and
tried to read anti-Trump conservatives too, to try to understand, like what you're saying and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
no, 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 no. And David Fromm is another. I mean, I wouldn't vote for them,
Yeah.
but I would feel like I was engaging in real politics as I engage them.
Uh,
Where my ideas are maybe changed, maybe
yeah.
in the direction they say, maybe not. But
Hmm.
whatever it is, it's something that I've thought more clearly and deeply about because of my engagement with them.
Hmm.
And I think it begins with that of how do I value your lived experiences out of which you have formulated the opinions you do.
Yeah. I
I
think
mean,
that's,
I don't have much sympathy for white supremacists.
yeah.
And I don't have much sympathy for all Aryan type of nations and church. I don't even have much sympathy for the prosperity church, the prosperity gospel, I suppose it's called. Because I think it just fundamentally misunderstands Christianity. There's not much I can say about
Yeah.
that. If Jesus is your vehicle for material success, I wonder what New Testament you read,
Yeah.
or
You know,
even if you've read it at all. And but even when I encounter someone in that thing, I try to find what in their lived experience produced this,
mm,
and is there a way to touch that?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't think that diminishes my um, capacity or my stands with people who have been abused by Trump.
Yeah.
Uh, and it may work more toward alleviating that than being obnoxious about it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons I really was interested in Will D. Campbell. He
Mhm.
seemed to be able to both speak out against racism, but reach out to Southern whites and stuff. I think, that's, It was sort of a big find for me. I'm curious. I think in the I think we have like 10 minutes left and stuff for this meeting, but I had one last question I wanted to
Sure.
ask you and stuff. You know, I know the church has very many churches have been affected by the polarization. I read that evangelical leaders,
Mhm.
many of them have voiced a lot of concern about uh, the popularity of QAnon conspiracy theories within their congregations. Um, from your view, how do you think the church can help with peace building in this polarized time in this country and stuff? Or is there no easy answer for that?
Well, there's no easy answer for that, whether it
No,
can be
okay.
or
I'm
not.
sorry for asking.
There just isn't any easy answer about that. I think that the basic structure, I mean, the basic structure of faith is participating and living and trusting a life structured by agape, or organized around agape, oriented toward would be better, agape.
Mhm,
And agape is translated, is the translation is love here,
mhm,
but it's divine love, and that's an important thing. So that there are actually four uses of agape, of love, in the Greek language, and three get the most. The fourth one has to do with family relationships, and I'm not going to go into that. But
mhm,
the three that dominate have to do with eros, which is we do sometimes translate as desire, but it emanates from a lack that we feel, and so how am I drawn to things? So that eros is not just simply erotic sexual orientation, but it
mhm.
has to do with ideals. That there's a lack in me, and I'm drawn to those ideals, those things that motivate me and move me because I know that I'm not and I want to be, can largely be characterized by agape.
Mhm.
Philia is friendship, is normally translated as friendship as well. It's um, it has to do with, and I think, with social glue. I mean, because it runs, philia is used to describe what is really true friends in Aristotle. Uh,
Mhm.
that true friends are people who make you better person, is the way I would translate that stuff. But it can apply to the relationships that make a city work. They can apply to relationships that are business relationships, and even ones of just enjoying your presence. These are below those are below in hierarchy what Aristotle thinks is the kind of friendships in which you make each other better people. And
Oh,
I would agree with that. But when they use philia, at some point they're talking about social glue. And
okay.
so there is a important element in our polarization. That's to do with philia. What's the social glue that holds us together?
Yeah.
And if you'll remind me, I want to say something about that before we close.
Yeah. We
But
got 7 minutes left. So
okay, so depend on me, huh? The last one, the last one is agape, and it is not one that proceeds from a lack, because it's divine love. So that the gods are self-sufficient; they don't have any lack,
yeah.
and so they aren't drawn by need or feeling a lack. They will things.
Mhm.
And so throughout, whenever you see, there's only a couple of places in the New Testament philia is used. And so every other place you see it, it's agape.
Okay.
And you have to say, well, what is this? If I'm, what does this mean? And I think it means willing good, that
Yeah.
you will. I don't have to like you. King was famous for saying, I sure am glad that my Lord and Savior didn't command me to like these people, because I find them really hard to like. But he commanded me to love them, which is I will them good.
Mhm.
And I think that if you try to live a life which is oriented toward willing people good, even if they don't will you good back, that it is the kind of thing that faith and church could promote
Okay. Okay.
in its differences.
Okay.
In the stuff that I wrote since that sermon that you had, I talked about what does it take to walk things back,
Yeah.
and I was struck by the fact that what used to hold us together was something called the American dream, and you believed it whether you were an immigrant or whether you were here or not. That by working hard and doing your best, you could make it in this world, and you
Yeah.
could pass on to your children more than you had. But
Yeah.
that no longer happens. That's no longer believable here.
Yeah.
And without that sense of story that holds us together, the we don't have anything that provides that social glue.
Yeah.
And so part of the dialogue process I think we need to engage is to talk about how do we make this place our home? What does it mean to make America home? And I
Yeah.
don't mean that in the kind of, there's a lots of Americas and why does the United States get to claim itself as America? But it's broader than that. It's broader than simply the United States.
Mhm.
It was, since by many people, it was a disaster by the folks who were here, but it was meant by the people who came. This was a vision of a new life. And
Yeah.
what did it mean to create a home for
Yeah.
each other? And I think that home still involves the native people who were here, as
Yeah.
well as all the immigrants who are all of us who are not native,
Yeah.
brought to that. But what does it mean to create a home here?
Mhm.
And I think that's the central task. The other central task, I think, is having to do with creating moral politics, is to rediscover the obligations we have toward each other.
Yeah.
That we, for the most part, don't think we have any. The neoliberals' real destruction was to destroy the sense of the social and the glue that held the social together in its
Yeah.
place, so that we didn't have to think about what our obligations were, that pursuing our self-interest automatically created wealth for
Yeah.
everyone else, and that we didn't have to attend to that sense of what obligations do I owe you,
Mhm.
and try to be realistic about it. I can't care about folks in India or folks even in the United States as much as I care about my family and its concern. But I still have the obligation to respect them and to take seriously their needs and to
Mhm.
see how I can attend to the kind, and particularly in the notion of a family, of a country. What is the things we owe one another as members of that country?
Mhm.
And I think when we do, and this is a serious issue with immigration. I don't know what the answer to immigration policy should be, but
Mhm.
I know that I have to count the relationships I have with those who are citizens of this country as somewhat different from those who are at the border. I'm not severed of relationships, but if I care more about immigrants at the border than I do opium addicts in Ohio, then I've laid the foundations for the destruction of this country.
Mhm. No, okay. Okay, well, thank you and stuff. But we have 3 minutes left.
But let me just say, I think we have obligations to both,
Mhm.
and I think we really need to seek through what they are.
Mhm.
And I don't have much of a clear, compelling idea of what they should be, but I think
Okay.
it's the task of thinking about them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. You said that you had one last thing to say and stuff, but and if you're
That's
able
what
to
it
say
was.
that in 2 minutes, oh, that's it.
That was it.
Okay. Well, thank you and stuff. I appreciate the fact that you were able to talk to me and stuff, and you know, I'm grateful and stuff. So, well, thank you very much. I guess this ends our talk for now, unless you have anything else.
Angela, I would add one thing,
Okay.
and that is, I think all of us should struggle with what is our common story.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a wonderful story. It's called Radical Hope, and it was written by John Lehrer, a philosopher, I think, at the University of Chicago. Maybe it's Lerner. And the he talks about I have to cut this short. He imagines going and seeing a woman fixing breakfast over a fire.
Mhm.
He said, "What are you doing?" And she would say, "I'm preparing my family to go out into the world and be a crow, an Indian, pro-Indian identity."
Mhm.
And 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 he said, and then there came a certain time when she couldn't say that anymore because being a member of the Crow tribe, it wasn't possible. The buffalo had gone away.
Oh,
We were on reservations. And I think I can imagine myself walking by me. I mean, my father fixed breakfast and asking, "What are you doing in the world?" And he said, "I'm preparing my family to go out and pursue the American dream." He can't say that anymore. Not simply because he's dead, but we can't say that anymore.
Hmm.
And I don't think we have the notion of what are we preparing ourselves to do and to
Yeah.
be. And I think that that's a loss and a void that is at the crux of our problem. And I
Hmm.
and I do think strongly that the church can help provide that story
Okay. Well, thank you.
or
Thank
construct
you.
that story. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We have less than a minute left and stuff. So I wanted to say thank you, Byron, and stuff. And you'll be seeing this video in probably an hour. So
Okay. All right, great. Thanks, Angelo.
sure. Have a good
You take
day.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.